conservation has been white, and it's time for conservation to be diverse. And I think it's an incredibly important thing for every organization to work on. It's really time.
Welcome to Women We Should Know with international speaker, mindset reset mentor, author, and your host, Leslie Michaels. With audacious honesty and candor, the Women We Should Know podcast presents the wisdom and life-empowering insights of women who are the embodiments of innovation and social evolution. Please join Leslie as she shares potent conversations that will inspire your personal and professional evolutions.
Well, good morning and welcome back to Women We Should Know. As is always the case, you can count on us to bring you women who have voices that are making huge changes in the world, that are creating new narratives, and that are bringing positive upliftment to us from all different directions. And speaking of different directions, today we have with us Betsy Gaines Quammen. Now, Betsy is the author of American Zion, Cliven Bundy, God and Public Lands of the West. Now that sounds fascinating, doesn't it? We'll talk about that as we go forward. Betsy's an environmentalist historian and writer, and she has a background in international conservation work, land issues, science denialism, oh, we've heard of that a lot lately, and anti-government agitation in the American West. She got her PhD from Montana State University with a focus on religion, history, and the philosophy of science. I am really excited to have this conversation about combining conservationism with religion. She has some fascinating perspectives on this that you'll want to hear. Wildlife and land protection are Betsy's passion. She worked for years in conservation projects in Mongolia, Bhutan, East Africa, and throughout the Western United States, and there's more to that as well. She served on boards from the National Sierra Club to Torrey House Press to Wild Earth Guardians, say that quickly 3 times, to the Dean's Council of the College of Letters and Science at Montana State University. Betsy was the founder and the executive director of the Tributary Fund, which brought together religious leadership, faith communities, and conservation activities in the US, Mongolia, and Bhutan. She is an independent scholar, an author. She's been published in the New York Times, the New York Daily, and the History News Network. Betsy lives in Bozeman, Montana. I hear it's beautiful there. I hope to make it soon. She lives with her husband and writer, David Quammen, with 2 huge dogs, an overweight cat, and a large rescue python. Who has a rescue python, and where do you get a rescue python? We'll have to hear about that. She's currently working on her second book, The West: Delusion, Reality, and Pandemic on the Far Side of America. That should be fascinating. Today, I am so pleased to have my new friend, Betsy Gaines Quammen, with us. Good morning, Betsy.
Good morning, Leslie. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I have just been mulling over in my mind which of the 1,000 topics that you can speak on intelligently that we can cram into this little podcast.
Well, I'm not sure if I'd say intelligently, but I could talk a lot about a lot of things.
There you go. So I finally decided what I'd like to do is ask you, what is it about you that wasn't in your bio that you would like the audience to know?
Oh my gosh, what about me? Well, Okay, I have been thinking a lot about this lately because I am giving a commencement speech on Saturday to a very small graduating class of an experiential education school here in Bozeman. And I have been thinking about what I can say to these kids that are graduating after a pretty rough year, facing some really large obstacles right now. And I am thinking about what motivated me when I was young. And I grew up at in Cincinnati, Ohio, working at the Cincinnati Zoo from the time I was 8 years old. And I hung out with cheetahs and snakes and caiman, which are kind of alligatory sort of guys, kinkajous, and which are beautiful mammals that they're from South America, and they're just they're strange mammals with prehensile tails, and they're adorable. They're hard to explain, but we'll Google them together later so I can show you how cute they are. In any case, I was thinking about what really motivated me as a young person, because I fell deeply in love with wildlife. And it was watching a video called Say Goodbye. It was a documentary, I think from the 70s. And I remember learning that animals were endangered and beginning to understand that I had a role in the world to love animals passionately, and that's how my strange and weird career has developed, that I really never anticipated would sort of get to a place where I was talking about militia and public lands, but it really came from my experience with the Cincinnati Zoo, interacting with animals from the time I was 8 years old.
Oh, that's brilliant. And it speaks to something I often say, which is that women are so multidimensional.
I could
look at society and think, oh, well, oh, she's an executive, she's this, she's that, but we have so many dimensions to us. They're in militias and religion around conservation and adopting pythons.
Yeah, that was something that I did with my husband. It was a sweet guy who needed a home after the kids that had brought him up moved out of the house and went to college. And I came downstairs one day and said, "So, should we get a python?" And my husband David said, "Sure." So he's living in my husband's office right now, and my nieces really love him. He's a very nice snake.
As snakes go.
As snakes go.
As snakes go. To give our audience a perspective on your commitment to the land and the issues you deal with the land. I know you mentioned that this is recently appointed Deb Haaland's area of focus, and this is a name that our audience likely knows. How does that associate? How can you use that as a way to help the audience understand what it is that you are doing with the land specifically before we get to the animals and the religion and the militias?
Oh gosh. Well, Deb Haaland is a really, really amazing woman who is now the head of the Department of the Interior. And she is from New Mexico, and she is from the Laguna Nation. And she is an incredibly inspiring, wonderful, I'm sorry, she's from the Laguna Pueblo.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the way to frame it. So forgive me for that error. But in any case, she's a Native woman who is going to be overseeing it. We have 640 million acres of public land in the United States, and she's going to be overseeing public land management, which is really thrilling as a Native woman who has a perspective that is different than us, different than white people who have, even white people who say in the West, my family has been here for generations, where her family has been here for far, far, far more generations than recent settlers who came in, of course, colonized native land. So it's going to be a wonderful head of this department who has an incredibly unique perspective. And it really does play into some of the things that I've been working on from, interpretations of the land. And I in the book, American Zion, really talk about the complete sort of, oh gosh, how do I explain this? The battles that have taken place recently over public land regulation, in particular ranching, and some of the vitriol in and around regulations managing ranching or that are part of ranching on public land. And I talk about how these families, in particular, I look at the Bundy family, which is the family who was involved both with the takeover at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, which was a 41-day occupation in 2016. 2 years before that, they'd been involved in an armed standoff in Nevada called the Battle of Bunkerville, when the government came to confiscate their cattle that was in trespass. They hadn't paid grazing fees since 1993. And when I talked to the family, I talked to the patriarch, Cliven Bundy, and he talked about his rights go back to when the first settler ancestor had his horse drink out of the Virgin River, which is where he's based. But what he didn't address is the day before that horse drank out of the river, it was Southern Paiute land. And I think that that's really important when we're looking at the history of land in the United States, that we remember the history goes back way before white settlement.
Yes, we are so good at appropriating.
Yes.
The kings and queens of appropriation. Well, thank you for that understanding. And I really appreciate the illumination and the reminder that, for instance, the day before the horse drank out of the river did exist. And there was a different dynamic around that land. When you're working with landowners and land appropriators, and you're dealing with these very sticky issues of armed standoffs, what is your ultimate desire in terms of outcome or
resolution, perhaps?
Resolution, but also newness of thought. I can't find a word for that, but that new perspective, re-perspectiving.
Yeah, I'm having trouble finding words today too. That's such a good question. And it's interesting because I've thought about what Deb Haaland is going to be potentially facing in terms of ongoing rebellion. And I do know that the Bundy family has networked not only with militia all over the country, but ranchers who are equally as disgruntled as Cliven. Now, I should say that that they're few and far between. I mean, most ranchers who ranch on public lands have workable relationships with the government, even though sometimes they're frustrated. There are places on public lands that are less suited for grazing. And I would love to see some buyouts of allotments that don't make sense, areas that are ecologically sensitive. I mean, for example, Cliven Bundy grazes his cows year round in the Mojave Desert. Now, if I was a one of
What do
Cliven's.
you graze on in the Mojave Desert?
It's very sparse, and it's very, I mean, they can't run that many cows, and these are huge expanses of land, and you don't have that many cows. That said, Cliven has increased his herd because he's taken over all the allotments of ranchers that took the buyout that he was offered as well, and refused it. So he's increased his herd from 150 cows to maybe 1,000 now. But it's not a great ecosystem for cows, and it gets rather hot. So I think there's so the cows are probably pretty miserable in August and July. But in terms of reperspectiving, which I love that word, you know, I'm on the board of Wild Earth Guardians, which you mentioned in my bio, which is in Santa Fe. It's based in New Mexico, and it's a fabulous group. And right now they're working with a ranching family to help buy them out of their allotments in the Gila wilderness, which is really cool. There's been a number of these buyouts with conservation groups that go in and restore the area after they've been grazed for I mean, since settlement, in some cases white settlement, and so that's one thing that I think in terms of looking at these sort of areas and areas that are ecologically sensitive. I think that's an option that I'd love to pursue, or love to see pursued more. But in the case of ongoing rebellion, I am afraid that we're going to see some more cases of this, because there hasn't been monitoring. I should say that there hasn't been ongoing relationship building and holding people accountable on public lands, especially during the last administration. But you could argue that that's been going on, even during the Obama administration. We really need to have a federal presence on public land that is monitoring, that's holding people accountable, because we are having people grazing beyond the limits of their permits. They're either overstocking, or they're being, they're supposed to rotate based on various months of the year. They have restrictions to things, and we're seeing people leave their cows for too long in certain areas. We're seeing degradation of habitat, degradation of watersheds, and it's a problem.
Well, we're back. You didn't even know we were gone, but you might notice a wardrobe change. Turned out the Wi-Fi went out across all of town. So now we're going to do part 2. So here we are, Betsy, back at it.
Yay.
Yay. Oh, they don't need to know all the journey that we've been through to get this together. But I do want to resume our conversation, and I want to speak about something that you mentioned in a previous non-recorded conversation about your interest in women in conservation.
I really feel that women conservationists are incredibly inspiring, amazing to work with. I grew up being inspired by Jane Goodall and Birute Galdakis and Diane Fossey, and I lived in Nairobi for a while, and Wangari Maathai was my absolute hero. She was the Green Movement founder and just an incredible conservationist. And I went on and had a career as an environmentalist in the conservation field, working with religious leaders. And I ran an organization called the Tributary Fund, and we were all women. And I had an incredible woman that I was working with in Mongolia. Her name is Chimga Lovandash, and she became one of my best friends. I mean, just an absolute, it's just a incredibly wonderful, funny, hardworking, brilliant woman who helped us engage with Buddhist monks or the lamas on various conservation issues, specifically looking at river conservation and fisheries conservation. And with her, incredible support, we were able to rebuild a Buddhist monastery that had been it had essentially, during the Stalinist purges, been burnt in the country. 30,000 Mongolian lamas were killed. It has a really hard history in terms of religious purges. We worked with Nawang Erdin in Bhutan, a wonderful, again, brilliant woman who helped us engage with monks and nuns in Bhutan on snow leopard conservation. And she just amazing. I mean, we just had the most marvelous time as women working together on conservation issues. Our entire staff in the United States was also women. Claire Baker, Sue Higgins, myself, we all worked together. We worked in passionate and just very, very hard driven ways. We were just really, really focused on our mission, and we had a ton of fun together.
Isn't it great when women come together? I'm all about women coming together, and we really know how to get things done.
I agree. And not only that, it's inspiring. Women are just fantastic to be with. And, I'm endlessly impressed. And as I said, inspired.
Yes. Yes. I love the way women can bring together a sensibility that doesn't have to always agree. And yet there is always coherence.
Yeah, and I actually think that there's a coherence without a self-focus. I mean, I really think women are devoted to doing good in the world, and they don't need the sort of focus on oneself. But I do think women need more recognition, because boy, are they incredibly effective.
Exactly. We don't need the recognition, but we deserve the recognition. And that's a really valuable point to bring forward about women. But I don't want to go too far down that path, because I know you and I could.
Yay, women!
Yay, women. I'm fascinated by the fact that your PhD is in religion. You're a conservationist, and I love what you said one time, but I don't understand it completely, about the fact that you consider yourself religiously promiscuous. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, yes, that was something that a friend of mine said, and I just think it's so funny. I, as a conservationist, really felt like we were not reaching broad audiences. And this is something that I've spent the last several years really looking at. And you and I talked about it too. How do we shift how do we shift the idea that public lands can be open to more diversity? I mean, public lands since the beginning of the American conservation movement have been white spaces, and prior to that they were native homeland. And so I looked that's something that I'm very focused on, very interested in. But I also, in looking at the Tributary Fund, which was my organization, I really felt like it was important to reach, as I said, broader audiences. And so I started working with religious leaders. And so in Mongolia, we were working with Buddhist monks. In Bhutan, Buddhist monks. In the United States, we worked with evangelical Christians on climate change. We were working with Jewish groups and Christian groups and Buddhist groups on pollinators and creating pollinator gardens. What we wanted to do was work with these religious leaders to examine sacred text, which of course predates the idea of conservation, but has very valuable lessons, such as Genesis, talking about God creating the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea, and they were good. And this idea that life on earth is good. It's a sacred value. And so, you know, I myself am a Buddhist, and I have found that as I have looked at various religious traditions, that I find a lot of merit and beauty in them, in spite of the fact that a lot of terrible things have been done in the name of religion. So I, as a conservationist, always was skeptical of religious beliefs, and I think that's pervasive. There's a fabulous documentary that came out several years ago called A Flock of Dodos, and it's a director that talks to professors and conservationists about their views of religion, and it's extremely condescending. And I think it's really important, if we're going to have broad audiences, to try to understand where other people are coming from. And that led me to doing my dissertation, which was on Mormon settlement, looking at Mormon worldview, a tradition I did not have any experience with, and trying to understand how some of these land use conflicts are informed by Mormon beliefs. And I went back and with the Bundys, as we talked about, the family that was engaged in these things, looking at early church belief and theology and how that has informed their fight. And so that was kind of a flip side of looking at traditions that encourage conservation. These were not encouraging conservation, but I should say that the Mormon Church has really looked at ways to be more conservation minded. So again, the Bundys don't reflect Mormon worldview. They have a particular take on it.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, I love that religiously promiscuous idea, because when we learn about other people's belief systems, we learn new ways to speak with each other, and we learn new ways to relate to each other. We learn new ways to help us collectively push the needle forward on any topic.
I think that's, it's to me, it's been so wonderful in so many ways. I feel like I have a better understanding of other people on this planet because religious perspectives really do inform the way people see things. And my particular interest, I was very interested in the way landscape is regarded religiously. And so it's been, and plus studying religion is just, it's really rich. I mean, I love the way that humans try to grapple with mystery. I love this idea of just this urge to understand the unknown. And to me, it's beautiful. I mean, the Upanishads are beautiful. The Bhagavad Gita is beautiful. The Bible's beautiful. And it's been really fabulous. I've enjoyed it in ways that I never expected.
That's beautiful. And I'll just take this moment right now. I'd like to invite you back and let's have that conversation. I studied for a period of time with a woman who had a PhD in world religion. And so I got to learn a little about so many different concepts. So please come back and let's talk about the religious factor and how people, but for wonderful. For today, however, I want to go back to something you said a few moments ago. I'm always awake I would say, to noticing where my privileged thinking pops up, what gets my attention. And when you spoke in an earlier conversation about the fact that the rivers and the campsites and the rock climbing areas, all these wonderful spaces of land, public lands, have been traditionally white spaces, a light went on in my mind. I thought, oh my gosh, I never considered that, but it's obviously true. Now, part of that may be because I'm not I consider camping being in a hotel that doesn't have room service, but that's just never been in a canoe, never been in a kayak. So I wasn't exposed, but I have an awareness because I live in the West where it is all open land. I don't know what I want to ask about that, but I wanted to bring that point forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's something that I've thought a lot about. And when I started working on my dissertation, I was very interested in this idea, this moment in history that we had native land, and then all of a sudden it was colonized. And then the other piece of that is conservation was a white male idea. There are very good pieces of it, the idea of initially protecting the bison from extinction, protecting wildlife refuges, but it and national parks, but it in essence erased native presence. And so you had landscape that was only accessible to privileged white people. It was people who could afford to go travel out west and camp and hunt and whatnot. And so they were white spaces. That needs to change. And
yes,
the conservation movement right now is facing a reckoning. They have to come to terms with the fact that they do have a racist past. And we're seeing wonderful groups emerge. I love this group here in Bozeman, Montana called Earthtone Outside, which is a group of young people of color who are really enthusiastic about skiing, hiking, rock climbing, and they do it together because these spaces have, in the last 100 years, been white spaces, and there has been a feeling of not feeling welcome or safe, and so this is something that I think is really important to address. And as I told you the other day, I have a wonderful friend from high school who I just adore, Peter Matthews, and he is a minister in Ohio. I went to high school in Ohio, and he's come out to Montana and loves it, absolutely loves it. And we've talked about, what can we do to get a group of African-American ministers out to Montana to go fly fishing? How can we open up these spaces to people of color, to just to show them how cool it is? And and I think it's happening more and more. But I looked up this article that I had mentioned to you a couple of days ago about this fear of being in places where people aren't around. And and I there is this, and again, I don't want to speak for people of color. I am a white woman, and so I feel very much more comfortable listening. But I went back to this article about these anxieties over being in the woods that bring back ideas of lynching, that these are places that have been unsafe and scary. This was an article in The Guardian in 2018 about African Americans who are now getting more interested in hiking, but having to grapple with some of these anxieties. And I think even
perfectly reasonable anxieties, I might add.
Absolutely.
Particularly in the climate we're in this exact moment.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes.
Yes,
I mean,
that's a
this,
different conversation as well.
right. Yeah. I mean, it's scary, and there's good reason for it. But I even
Yes,
think of, the whole Christian Cooper encounter in Central Park, where Christian Cooper was bird watching.
that's right. Or Amy Cooper and was the young woman, or I don't
Amy
know.
Cooper, they weren't related, but
They
they
weren't
had,
related, but I say young woman. She was a grown ass woman who should have
she
known
was a
better.
grown-ass woman
Yes.
who did the white woman horrible. I mean, I just the whole thing was so disgusting, and there's reason why there's anxiety there.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
yeah, that was a
In the middle of a big, our big city in this country, in public. Yeah. So I can't relate. I'm as white as they come in terms of how people see me, and my upbringing, but I can certainly be empathetic to the concern about being out in wild places.
yeah. I want to see these spaces get more and more inclusive. I went on a hike yesterday with an incredibly wonderful friend of mine. Her name is Francine Sprang Willis, and she's Northern Cheyenne. And she's just finished her master's degree from Columbia. She did it on oral history, oral traditions, and bison. And she's just one of the coolest women. And we had been wanting to get together, and she said, yeah, she texted me, I'm ready to walk with you on the land. And I just thought, that is, I'm so lucky to have friends to share these public spaces
Yes,
that have different ways of seeing.
you do. You are lucky. That is so beautiful. And I know that you personally have invested a lot of energy and time and attention into starting that level of education around diversity and inclusion and equity, and that you are highly conscious about wanting to tie your advocacy into your conservation efforts. It's which is just another form of advocacy. It's advocacy for the great mother.
Yeah, it has been something that I'm incredibly driven by, and I feel like it's really, really important. I'm on the board. I said earlier, I believe a couple of days ago when we started this, I'm on the board of Wild Earth Guardians, and that organization now is like organizations all over the country. Conservation organizations are working very hard to become more diverse, because conservation has been white, and it's time for conservation to be diverse. And I think it's an incredibly important thing for every organization to work on. It's really time.
It is time. It is time for, essentially, I see it as it is time for all of us to take responsibility for the planet, for the care and well-being of each other, all of each other, and the safety of all of each other, and stop this divisive and hostile compartmentalization.
Yeah, and it's funny, Leslie, because you did mention it earlier. I mean, we are at a really critical time. It's a hard time, and we need to continue to keep thinking about, as white people, we can't say, oh, the George Floyd decision was a good one, and I mean the
Chauvin.
Chauvin going to prison. It's really important to continue to keep at this, because
Yes.
We've got so much work to do.
So much work to do. And it is, I personally agree with the sentiment that it is on white people. And I personally think it is on white women.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, because white women, as we know with Amy Coomer, can be awful.
Yes.
But women can also be stalwart. And I hope that we have to.
So as we come to this place where not ready to, but we have to close out.
Oh, yes.
We could just sit here for 3 days and talk, the two of us.
We could.
I know, but we can't. So what I would like to ask you is, based on the fact that we all need to become better stewards of the planet, of our brothers and the safety of our brothers and sisters, in terms of the planet, strictly the planet, we all know to recycle. We all know not to throw a straw out the window and these types of things. But if you had 2 or 3 tips, 2 or 3 encouragements that you could offer to women who are listening of how they can, within the context of their hyper busy lives, be more proactive stewards, what would you offer?
Definitely look in your area and see what organizations are doing good work. I love Wild Earth Guardians, and that's in New Mexico. And also look at organizations that are diverse. Make sure that the gifts that you give, if you get involved, that these are organizations committed to diversity.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a really good one.
Yeah, and then just look at your own footprint. I mean, what does your diet look like? Are you driving a lot? Could you take your bike? And little things like that. But I think the biggest thing that you can do is vote for people who care about the planet. Vote for them. Get out there. I mean, right now our democracy is hanging by a thread, and it chills me. And so really get involved politically for any number of reasons, for equity and diversity, for conservation, for democracy. Uplift women, uplift people of color, take care of your kids, raise them to care about the planet.
And that primarily falls to women. And that's one of the reasons I say women have the power and women have the responsibility.
Yes, we do. And we need to take that seriously, because each one of us is tasked with this. We are tasked with it. And we have to make it our mission. We have to take it seriously. And we can't put on blinders, because right now things aren't great.
That's right. And even for women, I'm going to speak to the women who are listening who say, but I don't have kids. Well, I don't either.
I don't either.
I don't have kids. But in June and July, I am working with an organization called True Kids One here in Taos. Every summer they have camps and they're free, because it's not a big secret that New Mexico is a poor state. They're free, and every year they have a theme, and this year their theme is media. So I'm going to go in and teach these kids a series of classes in how to do a podcast, how to build a podcast. So it doesn't matter if you have kids or not, you can influence children. And that's important.
Yes, it absolutely is. It sounds like a terrific program.
I'm very excited to have been honored with the invitation to come and participate. Yes.
Yay.
Yes. So I'm going to ask you one more favor, Betsy.
Yes.
I want everyone to know that when we launch Betsy's podcast on my website, there will be program notes with how to get in touch with her URL, all of that information, because I know you're going to want to know more about this woman and what she does. In addition to that, would you provide for all of our audience who are going to go and read your podcast or your program notes, a list of maybe 4 or 5 organizations, 4 or 5 books that they could access to further educate themselves about everyday conservation.
Absolutely. I would love to. I have some very, very, I think, rich suggestions and things that would be of interest.
Wonderful. And knowing Betsy, she's not going to give you anything too heady. Well, maybe one for those of us who are heady, but information that's really accessible for the majority of us. Betsy, I thank you so much for being with us today.
Leslie, it has been a pleasure. It just makes me want to talk to you more and more. I look forward to it down the road.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to those 3 bottles of wine and bottle of scotch when I come to Bozeman.
Yes.
Yes, it is true, audience. We are just a couple of lushes. That's the other side of the story. I want to thank all of you for coming and joining us today. I trust that you received numerous nuggets, maybe on a variety of topics, because we did bring a lot of focus to women in the way we are in the world in a number of different ways. I invite you to be sure and push the button and subscribe so that as we go forward and we have more wonderful female guests, you get to hear them. And most importantly, you'll get notified when Betsy comes back on the show. In closing, I'd just like to remind you that you are stronger and you are wiser than you know.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We hope you received inspiration for expanding your own social innovation and influence. Help us inspire others by sharing this episode and leaving your comments over at lesliemichaels.com/podcast. For more tips, insights, and support in creating a fully audacious, professional, and personal lifestyle you love, visit our Women We Should Know community on Facebook.